Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really pleased that so many of you have been able to join us with, I'm sure you'll agree, an absolutely fabulous expert panel. I do have an apology at the moment. We're having a few technical difficulties joining one of our panel speakers, that's Professor David Saenz, but hopefully he should be able to join us a little bit later on. My name's Ayse Ince and I'm a Senior Associate Solicitor at Irwin Mitchell Solicitors. I'm going to just introduce the panel members to start with. We have Amelia, CEO of Suicide&Co, and Rebecca, who is an ambassador for SOBS. That's another suicide bereavement charity, and also a counsellor for Suicide&Co. Hopefully we'll also be joined by David Saenz, and he is a professor mental health nurse as well. So today, thank you for joining us. A bit of safety netting. Today you'll hear, I am sure, a lot of content which some of you might find triggering, upsetting. Please, if you feel the need to go offline today, we are recording the webinar and a link will be sent out afterwards. So be kind to yourself and look after yourself through the webinar today. A couple of housekeeping pointers as well in terms of the content and how we're going to run the webinar today. Amelia is going to first of all present on her charity and how she came about setting up Suicide&Co. Rebecca is then going to talk a little bit about the work that she does for SOBS and as a counsellor for Suicide&Co. And then we will hopefully be joined by David, who is going to talk a little bit more about the psychology of grief. And we've had some really interesting questions already that he's going to be touching upon around grief, guilt, and how complex grief can be once somebody has died by suicide. There's an option to carry on firing the questions through to us, so please do keep the questions coming. If you pop your name and a contact email address with your question, if we don't manage to get to the question, we'll be able to pick up with you a little bit later on or after the session, which would be great. Thank you. So without further ado, Amelia, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Ayse, and thank you so much, everyone, for having me here today. It's amazing to see so many of you on the call, and I also just want to say it's brilliant that Irwin Mitchell are putting on this webinar and continuing to kind of educate and bring awareness to this much needed topic. So thank you very much for having me. It's also amazing to be here with Rebecca, one of our counsellors. This is a fun excursion for us. So to introduce myself first, as Ayse said, I'm the CEO of Suicide&Co, a national charity that supports those who've lost loved ones to suicide, but I am also one of the co-founders. My kind of personal story in relation to the charity is my lived experience of suicide loss. When I was 19, I lost my mum to suicide. And it was a life-shattering event, but it was really the grief journey and the lack of support within that drove me 8 years later to start the charity. My previous background, I haven't been in the third sector my whole kind of time. My previous background is in marketing and media and sort of a decade there in business development and growth. But if we go on to the next slide, this is a photo when it arrives of me and my co-founder, Emma, and really the founding story. So we met each other when we were working in media, living in London, and Emma noticed me essentially avoiding the topic of talking about my family, my parents, and she had noticed herself with similar behaviours and actually just asked me whether mum was alive and then whether mum had died by suicide. And she had that confidence because she also had lived experience of losing her father to suicide. So this conversation for me was a very unique one. I really hadn't talked about it in the workplace and had not found a community of those bereaved. And so we talked about our shared experience really of a lack of support that was offered. I lost my mum in 2011 and I wasn't signposted to any services or aware of any charities at the time. We also discussed the kind of existing stigma surrounding suicide and death that made it really hard to talk to families, friends, new partners. But then we also spoke about, even though it was very delayed, the positive effect that counselling in our cases, in our unique scenario, had. But when we really discussed it, we thought, hang on, there should be services that exist. There should be counselling that's on offer that isn't, too overly priced and actually available to the UK. So we did a big analysis and we found that the services simply didn't exist. And this was back in 2019. There was great charity SOBS, who Rebecca's about to talk about, offering peer-to-peer support. But we really found that there was a lack of access to professional support. So in 2020, we decided to launch the charity. It was going to be a nice side hustle, giving us kind of purpose and meaning, and it is now my full-time job. So if you go on to the next slide, the thing that motivated us wasn't just the lack of support, but it was also the community that existed. That we couldn't believe the size of it. Now, firstly, when we talk about community, we mean everybody impacted by the loss of someone to suicide. And often people think about next of kin, close family members, friends, but there are much wider rings of effect that really also deserve support, conversation, and to make this subject easier to navigate. So when we look at actually the size of this audience, unfortunately, suicide statistics in the UK at the moment are actually at a high since 1999. And in 2022, in England and Wales, you can see on the slide that over 5,500 people died by suicide. That is a number that the whole sector in suicide prevention, including us, are trying to work to bring down. I, as an individual, sit on the steering group of the National Suicide Prevention Alliance, and we are all working with interventions, awareness activity to bring that number down. But with the existing number, there is research showing that between 135 and 6 people are directly impacted by one person dying by suicide. And so if you look at that, that actually means that in England and Wales alone, the direct community being affected, if you use the number 6, is 34,000 people each year. And if you use the number 135, is 700,000 people each year. And when you look at the sector, even now, we're only 4 years old, SOBS is great, it's still not enough support. And there are far too many people suffering in silence with their grief. Then the thing that was the extra motivation that we just had to get in here is this is also now actually by the England suicide prevention strategy named as a high-risk audience. There is a higher prevalence in suicidality for those bereaved by suicide, as you can see on the stat at the end of the slide. So that was the motivation, and we absolutely needed to get in here and help. Now, we wanted the charity to be absolutely service delivery focused. There's a lot of awareness activity happening, Movember, and things like that. But we wanted to offer services. So if you go on to the next slide, we have built an array of different services. And to give you some context into how, our kind of moral belief is that everyone has permission to grieve. And really what we need to talk about is people feeling like they have permission to grieve, right? Because that's the issue. A lot of people don't feel like they have permission to grieve. They think they should be getting on with it, or their grieving window is over, lots of different things, right? And there are kind of 2 key principles that we built our services around. One is that grief does not have a linear timeline. Your pain and your suffering is not just more acute right at the moment after the death. You can have waves of grief around different things that bring up moments where you need support again and you deserve it. The other side to that is that every support system is different. If we think about how we support our general mental health, some like yoga, some like reading, counselling, groups, befriending, whatever that is. So we wanted to build an array of services that could be applicable to as many people as possible. So these first top 4 services are our biggest ones: our counselling service, our helpline, our app, and our guidance and lived experience. And I'm going to talk in more detail about that on the next slide. But 2 that I just want to reference here is we've started to do more support events. We started the charity in COVID, so we were remote only for 2 years, and now we are stepping out into in-person. We've got a retreat coming up in October, and we're hoping to do more kind of workshops and things in person to offer that as well. And we also support businesses in the aftermath if they have lost an employee to suicide. And we have lots of guidance on our website of how to navigate suicide bereavement in the workplace if an employee has been bereaved by suicide. So if we go on to kind of our key service information, and there's a lot of information here. I do recognise that. I normally build it out, but it's easier not to. So our counselling service is our biggest service, and people refer themselves online or via helplines. We do work very closely with the rest of the sector, and about 45% of our referrals come from somebody at another charity recommending our service. It's accessible to anybody over the age of 18 who lives in England and Wales. And a key point for the service at the moment is that people need to be bereaved for at least 6 months before they can access the counselling. And that's both an operational need for us, but also an efficacy point at the moment, although it is under review, I would say. The brilliant part is that people are then offered an assessment and 12 sessions of counselling completely free of charge. This is really unique in the space. And the other thing that's unique is that we work with qualified, trained counsellors. Rebecca is one, and we have 31 of them. So we are working with really legitimate experience that really means we can take a high level of suicide risk in our service, but also give a really ethical and impactful experience for our clients. Also, I want to say you can be any relationship type. So cousin, friend, a colleague, anything like that. If you've been bereaved by suicide, you can access the service. Then our helplines, our second biggest service, is open Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And it's practical and emotional support. It is a team of staff. They're again trained in the expertise of both of these areas. And they are a lovely group of individuals who are worth a chat. You don't have to be needing help or in a moment of severe overwhelm to give them a ring. It could be anything you're navigating with your suicide-related grief that you can call them about. And also in early bereavement, pre-6 months, we can provide regular calls and check-ins with that team every week. We then have our app, and it provides self-care exercises across a range of different things. So journaling, anti-stress, things like that. Things that if you're struggling in the middle of the night, in my lived experience, sleep was really hard, that can help you. Now, at the moment, that's only on iPhones. Big apologies to any Android users. We are trying to fundraise to get it onto all devices, but we're in the process of that. And then on our website, it is absolutely packed full of resources. There's a help hub, which signposts to softer resources like podcasts, books, other services, peer-to-peer support like SOBS. We then have a specific area talking about how to have better conversations around suicide-related grief, really good section. And then the last one is a collection of lived experience. It is over 200 letters that people have written to their loved ones that have died by suicide. And it is a space for resonance, it's a space for reflection, but also the action of journaling and writing a letter to your loved one who's died is actually very cathartic as well. So then the last page is just talking about our impact. And the reason I highlight this on the next slide, is just to show you if you're in a space where you can make referrals or signposts, absolutely do. We're working at a really big level now, even though we've only been around for 4 years. 4 years. We receive between 15 and 18 people applying on average each month for the counselling service. So it's between 60 and 70 new people each month, although we've had 85 people actually apply in July and August. We get loads of people coming to our website, but really importantly, we're operating at a big level with capacity now. We deliver on average about 500 counselling sessions each month, and I only found out this morning that we've just surpassed a milestone where we have delivered over 10,000 counselling sessions since our existence, which is very cool. So if you know somebody bereaved by suicide or you're working in the space, I really, really encourage you to kind of learn a little bit more about our services and definitely refer people on. And that's me.
Thanks so much, Amelia. Well, first of all, big milestone. That means that you've reached out at 10,000 contact points at least on the counselling sessions. That's not your podcasts, that's not your in-person events. So that That's really incredible, because what is evident, I know from a lot of people that will be online today, and certainly in the work that, you know, I do, is that there is a huge gap in this service, isn't there? And it is being filled by people like you and people like Rebecca. And the service has to be right as well. It's not just bereavement counselling, standard bereavement counselling. It's got to be so niche and so right for that individual. And that's what, you know, you and Rebecca are offering with your charities. So actually, as a thank you, actually from the community, thank you for doing this for people who are bereaved by suicide. So
I also just realised I actually think I have another slide.
oh, of
Do I
course,
have
let's
another
go
slide?
back.
I'm so sorry. I normally finish
I'll
on this
go on
slide.
mute.
Yes. Don't worry. No. That was me, because I was ending. I just was realizing, but this is just the last thing I would say. And it's perfect to build on to Rebecca as well, because essentially our kind of moral belief is that even though, you know, your grief may not feel like it's going to get smaller, we absolutely can build back a life up around grief. And that is what we are doing. It's what SOBS are doing. So that was just kind of my final thing. I'm sorry that I forgot.
That's perfect. And there's been such a shift, hasn't there, at how we approach grief, you know, over the years, really. Everybody automatically assumed that it would shrink, actually, grief, and it will get better with time. But it's great that we have this appreciation and permission, like you referred to say, well, maybe it won't, but hopefully everybody can build a different life to, you know, how it was before their grief. Thank you so much, Amelia. So when Amelia, Rebecca and David, who I hope will join us a little bit later on, we're talking about the content for this webinar, we felt, and I was very much led by the experts in this, which are Rebecca, Amelia and David, what could we do ahead of World Suicide Prevention Day? There's going to be a lot of conversations and a lot of content around World Suicide Prevention Day, and we will touch upon that, on how you might look after yourself in the coming weeks as well, that might, you know, create more triggers for you. But, you know, the communication, the content, the drive around next week's Awareness Day is about communication. It's talking about the stigma and, you know, postvention, which is exactly what Amelia and Rebecca have been talking about. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you to Rebecca, who I've known for a very long time as well, and who I also love working with. Rebecca, if I can hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, thanks, Ayse. And again, like Amelia, thank you for the invite. And it's a privilege to be here today and talk about my experience and my journey, which I think very similar to Amelia's, perhaps a little bit different. For me, my bereavement was in 2014 when I lost my husband to suicide. So I'm approaching now the 10-year anniversary on the 8th of October. So much has happened in those 10 years. But one of the reasons why I want to talk today about possibly both roles, really, is how much they go hand in hand. When I lost Andy to suicide, I felt I had to speak to somebody else that this had happened to. I felt quite isolated. I went to see my GP, who wanted to give me antidepressants, and that was her answer, really. But I wasn't depressed, I was bereaved, and I felt very lonely, and I just wanted to talk to somebody that this had happened to. And somehow I stumbled across SOBS, Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide, as you can see on the first slide. And I actually attended my first group 5 days after my husband died, which some people find quite a shock, but that's the kind of person I am. I just needed to speak to somebody. And I went to my first group, which was in St Helens on Merseyside. There was actually only 5 people at the group, and 2 of those people were actually the facilitators. So that's when my journey started, really, with SOBS. And then a couple of weeks later, I went to the Liverpool group. If you want to move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So SOBS, there's about 77 groups across the country, and it's run by volunteers. So it's a charity similar to Suicide&Co. And you meet once a month. And it's usually for a couple of hours with a cup of tea, and it's in usually a community setting. So for me, SOBS is there to hopefully bring about suicide prevention through postvention. And what I mean by that is talking about it, meeting other people, not feeling so lonely and so isolated, does massively help you, I think, with your grief journey. Whether you can keep clicking on the slide. Okay, so that's the vision. But no one has to face their loss alone, and that it's for over 18s, it's for adults bereaved by suicide, and it should be in a timely and open-ended manner. So nobody questions you if you don't go every month. It's very confidential. Everyone is respectful. You can talk about your loss if you want to. If you don't want to, you can just sit and listen. But for me, it was just meeting other people. And I think as well, what SOBS gave me was hope, because I met a lot of people there who had been bereaved many years, and they were on their journey towards building a new life, a new future. And I remember one of the first groups I went to, there was a lady there, Angela Samata, who had all makeup on and nails painted. And I remember thinking, I just want to be like that. I want to close my eyes and I want to wake up and I want to feel in a better place. So going to SOBS really did help me. And from being an attendee at the group, a few years later, I was asked if I'd like to run one of the groups. So for several years, I've run the group in Liverpool, which has been an amazing experience. Thanks. Next slide, please. Okay, might be keep clicking, I'm afraid. So as I said before, there's 77 groups. They have face-to-face group, virtual groups, and there's a support line, email support. They work very much with third parties like Suicide&Co, and obviously do training. I've attended an assist course. They do mental health first aid courses. You also have volunteer training to take a group. And what's lovely about the group is that there's usually at least 2 to 3 people who are facilitators at the meetings who you can support each other, and you also get support from the head office. They also meet once a year and have a volunteer day where everyone can come together and share their experiences of running a group and also make contacts with other agencies. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, just some feedback from people who've attended the group. And I think you don't have to explain yourself. I think for me, going to SOBS, you didn't have to say why you were there. You didn't have to go into any details. And it's as though you felt like you belonged. The minute I walked in the room, I felt like there was a belonging. And everyone
so I'm actually on, but can you see there's a difference?
Oh, sorry. I think David's just come on.
Well, I should be quiet. At least I'm on, so I'm going to be quiet. Sorry, Rebecca.
No problem, no problem. So as I was saying, yes, it was nice to be able to sort of share your journey, your stories. You didn't have to explain yourself. There wasn't that sort of awkward silence when people ask you how your loved one has died. And I found that very helpful. Next slide, please. So why is postvention important? I was shocked to find out, and you'll see in some of the slides coming on, about the statistics about being bereaved by suicide. So I think that postvention is, as it says on the slide there, is the first step in continued prevention. So it creates an opportunity to communicate, as I've said. You don't feel stigmatized, because I still believe there is a stigma around suicide. I think it's better than it was for me 10 years ago, but it's still a massive ship to turn. And I still think there is that feeling of how your loved one died. And I think there can be an awkwardness by people when they find out how the person that you loved actually did end, that it did die, if that makes any sense. So that's why it's important to attend these groups, I think. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just some research. I know Amelia touched on it a little bit, and I've perhaps highlighted some of it there. So there is an insensitivity following a suicide bereavement, and you do feel slightly rejected and isolated. I think as well, people are shocked when they know how your loved ones died. I remember thinking at one point, I wish in a way that my husband had died of cancer. I wish he'd had a heart attack, because I felt not embarrassed. I felt guilty possibly about trying to explain what had happened. I felt like I had to explain how he died. I felt that I was perhaps being judged, that I should have known. We were married for 20 years. I should have prevented it. I could have done more. And that was how I felt in the early years. And you know, I've had people come to the house to do jobs, have asked me about whether I was married, and when I've told them that I lost my husband, a lot of people have looked at me and sort of screwed up their face at me, really, as though I'm a little bit weird, and that's the way it did make me feel. Also, when I reached out for counselling, and that's one of the reasons why I went to study to be a counsellor, is I did go to some agencies where they wouldn't speak to me because I'd been bereaved by suicide. There are some counsellors out there and some counselling services that say we don't deal with death, or oh no, I don't discuss suicide. And that again brings that isolation, doesn't it? And that stigma, and pushes you to feeling more and more lonely and possibly a bit rejected. So that's why for me, it's important to talk, and it is a joined up approach from the likes of SOBS and then leading on to Suicide&Co. So I always say when I'm at SOBS, because it's not counselling, it's peer-to-peer support, it's a charity and volunteers about Suicide&Co. And I can't emphasise how important I think Suicide&Co is. And I wish it had been there for me in the early days, definitely. Sorry, next slide, please. Okay, so again, some more research there. And I was quite shocked, really, at the statistics. I remember going to a social gathering. I used to work for the police as a police support staff, as an analyst. And I remember one of my bosses coming up to me and saying, oh, gosh, you know, did you realise you're 300 times more likely to take your own life? Or some statistics, and I'd left my two children at home. They were 14 and 18. But I remember those early years, the panic of, where were they? What were they doing? You know, if I couldn't get hold of them, were they going to be one of these statistics? And that's again why I think there should be more services. My GP should have known about the likes of SOBS and not wanted to give me a prescription of metrazapine, because that was not the answer for me. I needed somebody to talk to. I also did get a referral for counselling, but I was told it wasn't urgent. I didn't tick the right boxes. If I'd have been a member of the armed forces, or I was pregnant, I would have gone higher up the list. But which, you know, it is sad, really, isn't it? Because I did desperately need to speak to somebody. So that's why postvention is prevention, as far as I'm concerned. I do think counselling should be a few months in, maybe, not straight away. And that's why the likes of SOBS is important. But then I think it should be followed up by counselling. And I do believe if there'd been more services out there at the time of my husband's death, would he still be alive today? I don't know, and I won't be able to answer that. But I do think there needs to be more and more in the community, and it is still really struggling. Next slide, please. So I think those are my last couple of slides, just to give you some feedback, really, from people who've attended SOBS. A bit like myself, I went twice a month. And I do think it's important to need to know that there is somebody else there that has suffered a similar loss to you. And I do think that's also important. You know, and if people ask me, I do say that I've been bereaved by suicide, although I won't, you know, readily volunteer it. But I do think I can connect, as probably as Amelia can, with some of the feelings that people have when you've been bereaved by suicide. Because I think sometimes you do feel angry, you feel guilty, you go through a cycle of emotions, and it's just so important, I think, to be able to reach out to somebody and talk about it. And that's what I found very much with the counselling as well, that a lot of people in my position feel like that and still do. So that's why I think SOBS is an important group, but very much so in link with other charities. So that's just highlighting what I said, really, that 1 in 4 people of those people impacted by suicide found themselves in a position where they couldn't access professional support. And I think that's shocking, really, in today's world. So thank you everyone. Anyway, that's my last slide. So thank you.
Rebecca, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your story. And again, it resonates, doesn't it? Again, it's the stigma, not feeling able at the time that your husband died by suicide to be able to talk to other people. And again, just shows how important the services are that, you know, you and Amelia are offering, and what a beautiful relationship, really, between SOBS and Suicide&Co. There's that those face-to-face groups that's got the flexibility for individuals to choose how often they dip in and out of that group for as long as they need that group. It's an indefinite support group there for them. And of course, when they feel ready or post 6 months, there's the individual counselling support from Suicide&Co. So great working together with the charities. Really, really great. And I am so pleased that I think, did we have, we've got David.
You have him.
Fabulous. And we have the cherry on the cake. Can I please introduce David Sines, a professor, a mental health nurse, who, again, I have the pleasure of working with probably weekly on cases, who adds an incredible dimension to supporting our clients. And I cannot tell you how much I learn from him on a daily basis. So, David, could I please pass over to you?
Well, that's incredibly kind of you. And I've had a bit of a challenge getting onto the call. So I do apologise, Rebecca, for interrupting you so rudely. And may I just say thank you for sharing that very poignant story with us today. I speak with you today, or share with you some thoughts following, dare I say, probably a review of well over 100 cases in the United Kingdom and indeed Ireland, where people have actually lost their lives prematurely. And I'm always very careful with sensitivity in language. I'm afraid I'm having to use my phone because there's a challenge on my desktop. So please bear with me if I'm looking up and down a little bit at a few notes, which makes it a bit more challenging. But I think we know that losing any close, significant other, friend, family member to suicide brings with it unimaginable pain. I hope you will, by the end of my few moments with you, perhaps try to recognise that accurate empathy is something that professionals, I hope, like myself, feel. I've often said to Ayse and colleagues, when I review a case of any nature, I tend to want to go into the room to understand and feel part of that journey for that period of time. I'm not patronising. It's quite important to be able to do that, to really understand some of the nuances and the challenges and the emotions and feelings surrounding any case that may well end up in a court of law. So I'm very impartial, but also very aware of, I believe, the humanity. I mean, for me, I just made a couple of notes. Losing a loved one to suicide is one of the most painful experiences I think anyone can go through in their lives. And it's something I think I've recognised through so many narratives, so many case studies and stories. These relate to feelings of loss and loneliness experience, which are often magnified in suicide survivors by feelings of guilt. And I'm not using these terms loaded. They are terms that others have used to me, of guilt, confusion, rejection, anger regarding the outcomes, but also issues around the longer term effects of stigma and trauma. We know that surviving a family or friend who has taken their own life does result in what we now know is complicated and complex grief. You have all the normal grief reactions to any loss, but there are significant complexities and complications that really provide a compound number of challenges. I've always stated, and it's a really difficult one, that every case is unique, of course, but dare I say, we have to be patient with ourselves. And I would say you cannot set a time limit for the management of grief. As much as we'd like to, I think it's proven it's such a challenge to us. So the lingering effects of the loss are really very obvious. And you will have heard, I know from earlier speakers today, therapy can assist. But letting go of feelings of self-blame, rejection, hurt and anger are highly complex and not simple things to deal with whatsoever. But there's a mix I've found in so many survivors with deep set and deep felt guilt, self-blame and despair and anger. These often link so much to feelings of it's just too much to bear at specific times. And it can lead to very obsessive thoughts that are very pervasive about what we might have done differently. And I've heard that question raised so many times, but I will come back with a little more comment in a moment about why perhaps we should not always feel as guilty as we sometimes do about that. But those questions of what might we have done, how things might have been different, are always there. But can I just remind us that statistically 90% of people who actually complete suicide do have an associated mental illness or a diagnosable substance or alcohol diagnosed disorder. I'm afraid I have to say that I have found alcohol and substance misuse are quite pervasive in so many cases. And it's an added challenge. Of course, it's not the only issue, but it can create major trauma in families and family challenge long before. But this is not always the case, as well, you know. I'm only just making the point that this is an issue we know. So we do find that some of the prevailing stresses that I have found that seem to permeate through so many people's life stories relate to unrequited and unresolved earlier family trauma by the individual themselves that literally can be reignited at later stages, often unexpectedly, sometimes through other life events, but a lot of unresolved trauma from childhood, a lot of family dynamics that precede the surviving partner. So family dynamics that go back many years that can often suddenly come back in. We find financial challenge, of course, is another big issue for us. Stressors such as bullying, the impact of social media. We haven't got time, I know, Ayse, to go into that today, but we know it's a huge influencer and a huge challenge. And we find that with our younger people because unfortunately, taking one's own life is not the preserve of older persons at all. We know, and I've dealt with many cases of adolescent suicide, as so traumatic as that will be, but we know social pressure, social media pressure is another major issue for us here. The risk factors become very clear. They're often outside or out with the control of survivors, and I will make that point very clearly, but it doesn't stop the surviving partner still asking those questions about what I might have done differently, and do I still feel responsible for any part or contribution to the actual loss itself? And this is such a problem that we work through. But self-blame, of course, is toxic. I think we know that. It's not an easy thing to manage, but it's certainly important to recognise that it is toxic and we need to seek help to support ourselves. And I'm saying I'm using the royal we here in the sense of generic, trying not to personalise this at all. But there are times when we feel things are just too much to bear at certain times. I just want to quickly mention as well, I've seen this coming through persistently, particularly with men now, never mind females, that body image is becoming a real issue here. And it's quite interesting how it's balancing between the sexes. Because with children, I've done a lot of work with the Mental Health Foundation on this with body image and its impact on feelings of self-worth, feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, and stigma. But I would say this is a very important influence, which can then lead to certain addictive and compulsive behaviours as well. But please remember that grief is universal. It's global. It's well documented in the literature across our nations, and a lot of parallels are very clear. But we know that some survivors will feel angry. I call this free-floating anger. But anger is something I've discussed with Ayse on many occasions. And remember that some of our people who take their lives actually mask their symptoms. And Ayse and I are about to talk about a case very soon of that very nature. So it's not easy for survivors to have recognised the impact at times. There is a very genuine attempt by individuals to mask symptoms. Not always. The opposite can occur when you've got multiple cries for help and multiple requests that we can become slightly complacent because it's a constant request. But the masking is something always to bear in mind as well. And time after time after time, I have seen healthcare professionals, and I'm not going to challenge or be critical, but I will say this, have tended to ignore the frequent attenders to accident and emergency departments who have actually regularly attended crying for help. Then when the real summative event takes place, they just have treated that as yet another day in the life of a person. And that is such an important issue to bear in mind, that it's very hard to keep on top. It's wearying, and of course it's quite exhausting. But always trying to deal with multiple stressors can leave one feeling quite bewildered and asking that what if question so many times. But please remember, anger is a common emotion. It's often associated, again, I'm afraid to say, when we know alcohol or substance abuse has occurred. But anger in our reaction as survivors is equally important. Anger at ourselves, at the person who's left us, asking, why did you leave me with all of this? Why didn't you give me more opportunity to work with you, to understand? We could have done more together. Often against the healthcare services, sometimes quite legitimately, I make that point, sometimes to God, but I come back to this point, and the world in general, but it's often free-floating anger, which is really important. So many people then are also angry. I think I've made this point, but I'll emphasize it, at the person who's left us for depriving them of the opportunity to work things through. And I'm nearly finished, Ayse, but just a few more comments, if I may. I think with complicated grief, which is what we are dealing with here, it is often the case that individuals see time going forward, but they feel stuck in time. And really, those immense feelings of loss remain. And that's quite a challenge, that you move on and people don't quite understand, but being stuck with that loss and sometimes being plagued by the need to make sense of the loss and to understand why suicide completers made the decision to leave us. What remains are many unanswered questions that survivors feel they have to untangle, including maybe their role in any event surrounding the incident itself or event. I'm genuinely very compassionate to that, but I just think I have to say that. But we tend to continue to dig for clues, and understanding what the warning signs might have been, and that can then lead us to these compound feelings of self-doubt, anger, and self-blame. Finally, this leads us to a feeling perhaps of overestimation of our own responsibility, as well as those feelings of guilt, which are often misplaced but fully understood. So that what if scenario tends to play itself out. And finally, I will just remind us that those long-term toxic effects of surviving without seeking support, talking to colleagues, your support groups, can lead very clearly to trauma, often related to actual stigma, and that trauma relates to preoccupation with a loss, withdrawal, and of course those feelings of unmitigated anger. We need to understand more about traumatic grief, and we also very much need to know how to understand it. So thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts with you. Many of those, of course, relate to real narratives and stories that we've understood with the respect that should duly be given to those individuals.
David, thank you so much. You've picked up on so many issues that, Rebecca and Amelia have discussed already. And I think really the big message is, isn't it, is about kindness, about the kindness and giving individuals that space and free space to have those conversations. And obviously, it's important to acknowledge the stigma that's around suicide, but perhaps we need to also be acknowledging the stigma around anger. I think society sometimes shies away from, oh, anger, that's such a muddy emotion, but it's an emotion and it's a response and something that also needs to be given space to work through. So thank you so much, David. I think now we'll probably move on to some of the questions. We have got loads of questions, so thank you so much, everybody, for firing those through. Keep them coming. If we can't get get to them today, please pop your name, email address next to your question, and we'll absolutely get back to you after today, and I'll share those with our fabulous experts on the panel today. So I think one that we could probably deal with relatively quickly are a couple of questions about statistics before we move on to the questions that I think are going to invite and encourage some really good discussions between the panels. So does anybody have any statistics about, in terms of recorded suicides and the differences between males and females at all? Is there a difference with recorded, suicides?
I'm certainly going to say I'm not going to jump in on that. I didn't come prepared with those statistics. But the balance is certainly shifting. We know there's a very significant male suicide, but it's also linked to age and culture. It's a highly multivariate issue here that needs quite a lot of understanding. So it's not easy just to come up with statistics. I think it's affected by all kinds of variations, not just male or female.
Thank you, David. Is there anybody else that would like? Amelia?
Yes, I mean, I heard a different statistic recently, but I mean, the most quoted one, I've even seen it on posters in London this week, is that 75% of suicides are men. That is the most significant trend, is a gender split that we see. Although I would say in the UK, the two biggest statistical trends we see is the prevalence of male suicide and also an increase in young person suicide. So for people who are under the age of 34, suicide is the leading cause of death.
Thanks, Amelia. And actually, you've picked up there in terms of age-related suicides that have been recorded. And one of the questions has been, an acknowledgement around the support that children need following a suicide of a caregiver, grown up, somebody in their social circle. I know of a particular charity that does work with children. That's Alfie's Squad. Is there any, I know that you do signpost as well. You've got that facility, Amelia. Is there any other services out there for children?
Yes, I can also see Adele Owen in the chat, who's so amazing. She's one of our trustees and also works in the space. So yes, I think she's commented on that question, that Child Bereavement UK and Winston's Wish are the ones that we nationally refer to the most. I think it's a really important question, right? When one person dies by suicide, there's a huge number of people affected. And I think that the big thing with supporting children in this is that we need services that the children can access themselves, as well as support for the parents and teachers and education environments, so that they all feel equipped to navigate that time. And there's brilliant guidance online. There's videos, there's fantastic guidance around how to have a conversation with a child and tell them how the person has died. And I would say some of the guidance is really hard for parents to actually get their head around. But that is also why I would highly encourage conversation around the guidance. It's not the easiest to just pick up and follow. So make sure, that they are also told they can talk to a counsellor themselves, a helpline themselves, of actually how they navigate that.
That's great. And I know that Adele actually has, certainly for the Manchester area, has really supported making literature and storybooks available for children at the Manchester libraries. So if you do need a literature list, I'm sure we could reach out to Adele for some of the books that she's recommended for children to share with those people online. Please do whiz us an email if you would like that literature list, and I'm sure she would be able to help you with accessing those storybooks for children. So I think if it's okay, we'll try and move on to some of the bigger questions, which I think is going to open up a lot of questions on the panel. One of the questions was a little bit of an advice, really, about if there is a suicide or suspected suicide that occurs within the workplace, how you might, it's quite multi-layered, this question, how you might support other employees once that death has occurred, and any support that might be available. I think, Amelia, I might come to you first, given your tool, and then perhaps David, Rebecca, please do comment if you would like to.
Yes, so I mean, I think the the way to think about, I mean, so as a charity, we have support for organisations, and we split that across kind of 3 stakeholders. So we've got guides and guidance and offers of consultation calls with HR professionals if they're navigating somebody coming back to work from a bereavement by suicide, or if an employee's died by suicide. And then we have 2 lots of guidance, one for managers, they are such a key stakeholder, and for colleagues. And beyond that, of course, our core purpose is to support the people who are bereaved. So we have lots of guidance for them as well. Just to touch on that manager guidance, I think in businesses, we're often, well, actually, you know, even things like compassionate leave policies aren't as strong as they could be. But what's often forgotten about is what happens when the person comes back from compassionate leave. If you have a manager that doesn't know anything about the topic of suicide or death and finds it awkward, you are going to be working in an environment that you're walking on eggshells in. You feel like you're a burden. You feel like you're being avoided. And that absolutely can be solved. It takes very little effort to educate yourselves on some key tips to have better conversations. And for managers, there is an impetus and a need for them to take the lead in structuring conversations so that that person feels supported.
Thank you, Amelia. David, Rebecca?
So when I went back to work, it was 10 years ago, there was not a lot of these charities or systems, probably some to you, Amelia. I was lucky that I had a good, you know, my employers were good, and they opened the conversation. You know, they used to talk to me quite openly about it, and they were very supportive. So I found myself quite lucky in that respect. Although nobody really, I don't think, there'd never been any talk in any group, any training, anything like that. I was just fortunate, I think, that I had a sympathetic employer.
And that
Sorry, go on.
Go ahead, Amelia.
I was just going to say, I hear pockets of individual hero, like when you're led by an individual, you can get amazing responses to this. But I would say at least every week, hear of a story that is just heartbreaking. It is just not fair. People leaving employment, people just feeling completely isolated in their workplace, not being able to take you know, compassionate leave to attend a funeral. You know, there really is, especially in some industries where contracts are potentially not employee contracts, we're just seeing absolutely no regard for this.
I think you've made a very good point. And we have excellent employers. We have zero contract employers, of course, and we really probably can't get into all of those details. But I would just say this, that prior to returning to work, it is very important as a survivor to take as much advice and prepare yourselves through conversations with similar others, so that you can go back to work with some degree of both dignity and assertiveness, which is vital. I would also recommend, where you have a designated named occupational health team or a designated line manager, that you actually seek to meet with that person before your return to work to be able to facilitate that return. And I think that has helped quite significantly where those opportunities exist. I mean, in larger employer organisations, we do have mental health champions. We certainly have individuals who are really very supportive. But I think taking that first step to a degree of confidence, but you can only gain that confidence when you feel competent and capable to have that conversation. So the warm up, I'm using that word very loosely, by talking to others, finding the first words to break the ice when you come in, having rehearsed those first couple of sentences. When I give a lecture, I always prepare my first couple of lines. The rest will flow. But it's just holding your head up, feeling able to have that conversation, and having a sponsor, if it's a great friend in the workplace, a line manager, occupational health, but a good friend can be a great facilitator and an enabler.
Thanks, David. We've got just about 4 minutes left, so I think we can probably squeeze one question in. I should say we will respond to the questions, don't worry. There is also the bereavement conference that IM are holding on the 5th of December, and we're lucky enough that these speakers are going to be there, so you can also come and speak to them face to face at that event. So the last one, I'm going to try and tie a few points into one. There's a comment actually here, really important to have a variety of options available, because everybody's grief and bereavement is different. Everybody might not have the same need for accessing services. So, for example, Sing Their Name Choir, Speak Their Name, and Memorial Quilt projects. Thanks also to Jenna as well for just flagging that Grief Encounter do support face-to-face and offer face-to-face support services for children. So Jenna, thank you very much for just flagging that with us as well. So the last question then, which I think ties in with accessing different services for different individuals on how they might grieve or want to access support, is do females and males access services differently? So I guess it might well be, you know, you might see more males, females in your face-to-face groups, Rebecca, more online calls from. I'll open it up to you three. Please do comment.
I would say at SOBS, I would say 80% are female that attend the groups from when I do. I think women probably, I don't know, we talk more, we're out there more talking about our emotions, aren't we? I don't know whether there's still that phrase that men are still stiff upper lip and try to get on with it. I don't know whether the younger ones are any better at it now, but definitely around my bereavement and my experience of SOBS, it's been more female.
Yeah, we have similar stats. We're in the high 70s of females versus males in counselling. And what we have seen, because we've been trying to get that number up to be, you know, representative of the actual population we're serving. And if we were doing that, it would be 50-50. And, you know, ultimately, we are seeing that it's representation that needs to be more there. You know, service access is not cool. Like, accessing a service for a problem you have in mental health still isn't cool. All of the impetus is about having better conversations in the community, which is great. And we do need that as well. But we need more people saying, I went to counselling and it helped. I went to the doctor and I was referred to SOBS and it helped. You know, we don't have enough people saying that bit. We have people saying, I've now, you know, got through my grief and I've fundraised or whatever that is. We need more service access representation, because then we've directly seen, we released a video, it's on our YouTube, of a guy who's been through our counselling, and we saw a flurry of male applicants. Like, honestly, our statistics for that month went to 40% of men accessing counselling. That is what we need to see. So yeah, it's we're all working on it. The sector is actively trying to kind of bring more people in.
I think I would also add the diversity issue here. It's not just about male, female. I mentioned this before. It's ensuring that we do have active engagement and services from people who look like us, who feel part of our group. So there are issues around cultural diversity, which is vital. So faith groups are absolutely critical, but that also requires mediation with certain faith groups who do not regard suicide as being something that should actually be dealt with. So there's a lot of issues around this and certain communities, but I will just say to you all that to me, social media can offer in the right place support, particularly for men. I'm sure it does for women as well, but I'm coming up and agreeing completely with our speakers, Amelia, that we know the majority of men do not seek support, so it does need to be actually presented in such a way as to be meaningful. And sometimes social media groups between men have proven to be supportive.
Thanks so much, David. One last point I think I would mention, if you just excuse me whilst I'm scrolling, I think it's really important to flag and signpost where we can. The Luna Foundation have a directory of books for people of all ages as well. So again, it might well be that your preference is accessing support through literature or starting to understand how you start those conversations, and books are just a beautiful tool to do that. So thank you very much for that reference as well today. So we're on time, 1 minute over. I'm so sorry, but a huge thank you to our fabulous panel. I love working with you all, and thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you for joining us today and taking the time out of your busy days to join us on the webinar. If you've got any feedback, please do fill out the form, it might be, yes, please, can we have a take 2 of today for further information, which would be great. We'd love to hold another session with you. There is obviously the bereavement conference that I am holding in Manchester. That's the 5th of December. So keep your eyes peeled. It's free to attend. You'll just need to register online, and more details will be coming out in a few weeks. So thank you very much, and be kind, and show some awareness for next week. And I think that's all we can do, isn't it?
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
Ayse,
you.
very much. Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.